Character design is hard. It's one of the most important parts of any media. You want a character that both can be appealing and that also makes sense. Any person who has dabbled within the field can tell you can't just make one design and truly be happy for the most part. At least most of the time. It takes time to reach perfection. I've noticed as a guy who likes to dabble within the field a lot. Not professionally, but especially in fighting games. An appealing character is important, as well as them being well functioning, but just because most of the time they show perfection within their designs doesn't mean that they always deliver on that. And I want to talk about some designs that were just dead on arrival, and how, on examples I will show, they managed to improve them. Without further ado, let's get into it. Guilty Gear was always a franchise that I think never truly messed with designs. Maybe it's just my overwhelming bias, but most of the weirdest or off-looking designs weren't anything too big to fix. Like sure, Axel looked like this in Xrd, but most of his designs before and after were way better. So that's where I feel at least some characters fit into. Then Potemkin exists. Potemkin, for me at least, was always a character I liked. I know, weird, knowing how I feel about him gameplay wise, but in all the years of him being a Guilty Gear character and being usually relegated to a bottom tier, a thing he missed in the early days was, well, a good design. Where to even begin with this guy? This is not like the worst thing in the world, but it's definitely as bland as this franchise could go. You have a big character and what you decide to give him is just a huge collar, some gauntlets, and maybe some trousers. Like, okay. And yeah, I like Guilty Gear Strive designs, and you might point to the fact that some of them look less detailed than their old counterparts. Sure, but at least they kept enough to keep their vibe and feeling, as well as still having points of interest, making overall a decent and not so cluttered design in my opinion. This design has points of interest, that's for sure, but lacks any other feeling behind it. That's not to mention that after the first game, this design doesn't even make that much sense anymore, since all it does is tie back to the fact that he was a slave in Missing Link, aka the first game. In the X series, he isn't even a slave anymore, and he still has this damn design. It doesn't even have an absurd amount of belts. How can you claim to be a Guilty Gear design? Okay. Now, that was a lot to say that old Potemkin didn't look exactly the best, and they did eventually realize that. Starting in Xrd, he finally got a more militaristic green uniform, with ties back to his older design. And while Xrd's anatomy was weird, and they fixed that more with Strive and how they approached that game's art style, I'm still happy for both of these games for having this type of Potemkin, because it was a factor into me liking this guy more. But hey, maybe someone actually likes the original Potemkin design. I'm surprised, but hey, kudos to you. You saw something that I didn't, so hey, I have to compliment. This one will be long to talk about, so let's just jump directly into it. Orang was always a character with a relatively traditional design, at least in the early days. He wore a more classical taekwondo gi, while his alternative costume was more of a flare of 90s edge, since he was always a punky boy. And throughout the years, his design always went through those directions, with the only times he got a more drastic costume was, I guess, when he was more militarized, but those were always optional costumes, while the classical punky design was always the main costume. So hey, he seemed to be going in the good direction. Then Tekken 7 happened. Tekken 7's development was a mess for sure, and I'll take that into account. Working with a budget that made your face look like this isn't exactly the nicest experience, but I don't know who had the idea of, hey, let's make something new for Warring, then came up with this. It definitely took me a considerable amount of time to fully admit that this design just sucks pure ass, but now I'm a free man, and I must state this design sucks on so many levels. First things first, what happened to your hair? Why did they decide to make him ditch the air dye? It doesn't fit old Warang, and honestly, besides some parts of his design, it doesn't really fit him color-wise. And speaking of this costume, second, what is your costume? It took me a bit to see what was wrong with it, but the more I saw, the more I hated. Details like his neck area or his weird sleeve and his jacket being the only blue color in this design just deviate from what the hell this was trying to make me feel. You could have made something cool, but you ended up making something that just doesn't scream Warang that much and is just an eyesore to look at. Third of all, why did you give him an eye patch? I know it's a meme to say that it was just a phase that he got a grenade to the eye and pretended to be injured and now he's just fine the whole time, but I'm confused to the events that occurred. Like, why highlight the fact he got an eye patch in the same game where he got hit in the eye, only for him to be just fine? I am dead serious. Why couldn't have it just been like an alternative design? This is just to add more to the mess of this design, to be honest. Thankfully, Tekken 8 happened, and despite the fact that Bandai wants to milk the shit out of this game, I'll say that they at least did a perfect job with the designs in this game, especially with Warang after what the hell happened in Tekken 7, going back to a more traditional look that manages to innovate on his old design in a new way, while also bringing ties back to characters important to him. And when it comes to his alternative, it just feels like a better version of his older costume. Like, I'll say it can be a hit or miss costume, but at least it goes full punk unlike whatever the hell they pulled with Tekken 7, so I'll give them that. So yeah, please never take Tekken 7 Warang as a design inspiration again, Bandai. Thank you.
You really want me to punch a hole through you?
I wanted to talk about more characters, but knowing that I've been talking for way too long, I'm going to talk about way more. I've decided to cap on the last guy I really wanted to talk about. Street Fighter can 100% make the most banger and iconic designs to ever exist, while also at the same time make a character like Rufus. So while I like the game series a lot, I can only say that games like Street Fighter V existed. I won't talk about gameplay wise because it's not in my field to overanalyze gameplay. When it comes to character design and redesigns though, it generally felt like the peak of some characters, and some original characters look genuinely intriguing and well crafted, so you can praise Street Fighter V for a lot. Unless you're talking about Ed. To start, he actually originally was in Street Fighter IV, well, at least in Balrog's ending, and until his DLC debuted in Street Fighter V, his design was just skinny kid with a grey hoodie on, and yeah, it's not the most appealing thing, I know. The only good thing that came out of Ed was that, unlike other piles of muscle, he was a relatively skinny kid who could try to fight. Then he came to the game looking like this. I can't say how I reacted at the time, I was literally 5 or something, but the moment I saw this design right next to this design, I got confused. I won't sugarcoat it, this design just sucks ass. There's a great video by Sugar Punch who discussed this back in the day in great detail, but his design is just all over the place. For a design that's meant to show that he is a leader, to have a military suit with the most muted colors doesn't really help him pop out a lot. And for sure, this color palette could work on, say, a less fancy design, but when it's meant to be a design that's more to the fancy side, looks kinda odd. And second of all things, the way his clothing is just not meant to be symmetrical is an issue because of how it was just modeled and what Street Fighter V was on. He has a relatively alright commander hat with a random cap to the side that's just distracting. To this day, I have not found one person who thought this was a good design choice. And on top of that, his shoulder cape is just not functional because of what this game was. Like, shoulder capes, when they have a moment to shine, they are usually well animated. The way this one was just modeled and the engine was put on just made me question what was going in their minds, genuinely. So yeah, this design is definitely a good example of just not executing a design well visually and gameplay wise, which is why when he came back to Street Fighter 6, they turned him into Leon. I mean, they finally fixed their shit and gave us something actually interesting. Also, yeah, his colors are still relatively muted, but at the same time, as mentioned prior, a less fancy outfit makes this more passable, and I'll say this outfit fits him way more of his personality compared to what he was in the last game, and feels more like what his first attempt should have been, since it's way more functional despite its simplicity, and it finally gives him less of a usually defined amount of muscles, only slightly though. Also, gotta mention this, but Costume 3 exists, and it's amazing that they finally fixed how his old design is. It still has a lot of the muted colors his original design had, but texturing surely helped it differentiate his golden and fabric patterns more. Design-wise, they finally fixed his dumb head and his stupid coat. Who knew that giving him a trench coat could save his original design? But hey, it certainly did. And yeah, I almost say that this could be my favorite Ed costume right next to his default in Street Fighter 6. But hey, this new design just proves that just because a design can be god-awful in one game, doesn't mean it will be god-awful forever. Anyways, that was all the characters I had planned to talk today. I had a few more, but I ended up talking way too much, and my brain doesn't feel like saying more words, so hey, if you want me to talk about more characters, feel free to say which. I'm happy to hear suggestions, so yeah. I don't know what else to say, just bye.